So I wanted to show you these watercolors. They date from about, they're from about 8-9 years ago. And the reason I thought it would be a good idea to look at them is that essentially they're the genesis of the work that I've been doing now with oil. Traditionally with oil, you work in an opaque way, and the most luminous areas are added afterwards on top in an opaque fashion, whereas with watercolors, you get your light by retaining the white of the paper. What I discovered with watercolor is transparency, and by working with transparent pigments on white paper, some of the effects were magical. So I was working in this series, in the circular ones. You could keep adding one shape on top of another. You could see right through, so you see the whole process all the way from its inception. You see how a piece is born, because every layer is visible. And I found that fascinating, not just visually, but also psychologically, in terms of what a person is made of. You know, the accumulation of important moments as how we define a life for ourselves, how we define even an identity. More and more I was thinking of color in prismatic way. In other words, rather than to think of color as pigment, I was thinking of color as light. So this is an offshoot of the last watercolors that I was showing you earlier. And by the way, this is the largest sizes that I've been working on, that I've worked on in the past. I hadn't worked that large in 15 years. I wanted the paintings to be open. I wanted the paintings to invite the viewer to mentally project oneself into the painting. So it's very much in relation to the body that these are conceived on this scale. Space that you can, if not physically enter, you can certainly mentally project yourself in it. And the sense of breadth. It was very important that I create a sense of a luminous space which is breathing. So, you know, that's the thing with pictorial space. Obviously, even though it's not a real, literal space, there is a suspension of disbelief. I've always thought there's something, again, you know, close to magical in creating that much breadth into something that is flat. I do a lot of these color studies before I commit a passage to the canvas. So I do endless studies like this. I do sheets and sheets and sheets until I'm convinced that all the relationships are harmonious. And then the other thing I do is study the space. So all these drawings here, I do a lot of those. So basically when I go in the studio, even though I do a lot of studies and there's a part of my process which is analytical in terms of color and space, but when I go in the studio, I'm curious to know, oh, what's going to happen today that I haven't done before. I sometimes set up a premise where, for instance, I didn't want to use red with this painting. I wanted to create yellow, which is not a particularly spatially assertive color, but I wanted that to be the foreground, and then see how it would relate with the other elements in relationship to that. So here I wanted to do something that was different. I wanted to set up a luminous field, but with only cool tones. So I kept the whole canvas in the blue family. Before I commit any mark to a canvas, I usually spend a lot of time looking at it in terms of how it affects my body. Since I don't go into it, you know, trying to describe something that exists outside of the experience of making the work, I have to spend time with the sensation of being in front of that particular area. So I'll just look at it. I just stand there and look at it. Another thing that's very important in my work is the parallel of the relationship to music. You know, I think of it as creating a set of parameters within which I can improvise. So it's not unlike, you know, a jazz musician doing scales all day long, so that when they're finally hitting their groove, they're not nervous about their technique. They can really create based on a foundation of intimate knowledge with the architecture of their medium.